Okay, class. So, second video of Unit 2, right? We're breaking down some aesthetics and metaphysical concerns and critical concerns that come with understanding and interpreting Chinese poetry. Um, there are, much like in the first unit where I gave you guys a quick crash course on here's some baseline things we can use to talk about poetry, there are a lot of philosophical and historical concepts that we're going to really only have time to brush on here to keep moving, right? There are, in all honesty, books on books on books written about a lot of this stuff, but I just want to give you kind of a primer, a taste test of a sample of things that have been discussed and are commonly discussed when looking at historical Chinese literature. And then we can talk a little bit and speculate at the end on how do these things complicate our relationship with translating someone like Du Fu, right? Who has this great complexity of understanding across history. Okay. So there is a selection from a book that I mentioned on the course website, but also in the previous video that I was trying to get, which is a Chinese Theories on Literature book. It's about $1,000 if you can get a good copy of it. I'm not going to buy it. I'm familiar with it because it was brought up by a professor of mine back in university who used to teach at who was a scholar of like Korean, Japanese, and Chinese literature. And he was kind enough to scan stuff out of his copy of it, so I still happen to find those scans after tearing my apartment apart over the weekend and most of this week, but I found it, right, in an old folder, right, and I'm going to upload them for you, but we're going to touch on some of the things that are first discussed in the earlier chapters of it, right? It goes through a number of different angles at which the works of literature can be approached and how over time they've been interpreted in different ways, right? I think the first one, the metaphysical, is perhaps most applicable to what we're talking about, which is why I want to spend more time on it. But it has a lot to say about a lot of different lenses, right? And we'll mention those briefly towards the end. So across history in general, but we're in this instance we're talking about Chinese history and artistic history through literature and otherwise. There's been a whole bunch of different schools or methods of thought brought in about how to interpret that literature, right? And the book Skin provides this example, but just to talk about it, they suggest kind of like four things of note where we're discussing the different relationships between. So we have the writer and the reader on opposite ends, and they're communicating via both the work as it exists and its metaphysics, right, which is the idea of what does it mean, right? How does it play into the greater picture? How does it fit into the world? What's it doing? And all four of these kind of things interact in different ways via each other, which is what the text argues. And I think that is applicable very much to thought processes that would have been in place at the time that Du Fu was writing. Okay, so we have a number of broader scope ideas of how things were to be structured, even in a governmental level, but also that implies down through a cultural level, right? Think, for example, of like the United States' obsession with democracy and freedom as just like a jingoistic thing, right? But also, you know, ostensibly supposed to be core to what the government's supposed to be shaped like. Whether it is or not is a matter of plentiful debate, right? But it's like a core idea that's kicked around in discussions of it within the cultural space of the United States, right? Similar kind of philosophical fixations existed in every country. And in Du Fu's time in China, in that kind of like 8th century period, he's kind of at the nexus of a lot of what comes to be traditional Chinese thought, right? He's post-Confucius, post the introduction of both Buddhism and Taoism, right? Which all interplay with each other and are not identical, but have a lot that comes to form Chinese conceptions of these ideas that spread elsewhere, right? Confucianism is probably the most prominent for a couple reasons, right? it's, the teachings of Confucius, have influenced them greatly. It's a code of ethics more than anything. Strong family ties, venerating your ancestors, respecting the wisdom of your elders, right? Things that we've come to hear in many different cultures, right? But specifically the idea of family as a model of government, right? The idea that that kind of nuclear family shape and that respect up the chain towards your elder people should also apply to the government. Interesting. It comes into a lot of play with Imperial China, right? One of the many espousers of the, endlessly present line across many spiritualities and philosophies of that, do not do unto others as you do not, do unto others as you wish done to you. The golden rule, right? There are some people who consider Confucius's version of it the silver rule because it's in the negative. Don't do to others what you don't want to have done to yourself, right? Very big idea of reciprocity, right? Putting something out, get something back, cause and effect, right? Equality in things, right? And he also very strongly argued for a moral center in government. Namely, the idea is that the idea of morality, what is right and wrong, even in a legal sense, should be more defined by people's morals and appealing to morals, and it should just be a law, right? The idea that someone can steal, and if it's just a law, they've stolen, and they broke the law, and they're going to try and avoid punishment, but they don't necessarily feel bad about it, right? But if the government also strongly insists on and follows the idea that stealing is in of itself a moral failing, right? They will be more motivated by the idea of not wanting to feel shame, right? And not wanting to feel bad in general, right? Like a bad person, than they would ever be from trying to flee punishment, right? So, an interesting concept, right? The interplay of laws and morals are something that scholars have talked about for millennia, right? And it's not a discussion that's going to talk anytime soon, but Confucius weighed in a lot on it. And his thoughts very, very strongly imprinted themselves onto how government was run, right? Shortly before Confucianism, we also had Taoism kind of come into existence there, the way of the Tao, the way, right? Comes from all the way back in the 4th century, so not that shortly, but it kind of evolves in its implementation into China, right? So it's philosophy, but also a spiritual tradition, and this is super basic. Obviously this isn't a comparative religions course, and we could talk a lot more about this, but from a concept of criticism, the thing that we're going to take the most focus on here for the literature is that perfection and kind of vaunted success is found through harmony, simplicity, compassion, and humility, right? So a very empathetic look at things, which Du Fu was super into, right? And it plays very well off of Confucian ideals, right, which come somewhat out of that space, which is the do unto others, right? Understand your fellow man, right? Understand fellow human beings, what they're like, right? And how they feel, and how what you do has consequences. Okay, Buddhism also hugely influential at this time, right? It had also come to China by this time, very, very well integrated. It evolves steadily through its intermingling with Taoism and Confucianism into Chinese Buddhism, which then kind of spreads out from there, and it is a lot of the shaper for how a lot of the other East Asian nations view Buddhism, right? They're often kind of discussed as the 3 big metaphysical lenses for literature, is this playing into more Taoist ideals? Is this playing more into Confucian ideals, and so on and so forth? It gets discussed a lot in the scholarly work around Du Fu, right? I'm going to upload some scans to talk a bit about the greater lenses in general. Excuse me. But more specifically, right, we have this idea that Let me get my thought back from the phone call. Oh, so we have this more specific ideal that different people at different times are trying essentially to figure out which one Dufu ascribes to, right? Dufu would have had understandings of these particular spaces, right? These particular understandings, right? Of how the world worked, how we should interact with it, how writing should interact with it, how his art should interact, right? What's interesting, though, is that he's very strongly aligned, oftentimes, with Confucianism in discussion, right? I am not an expert enough to say that's bullshit, right? But the stronger thing is to me is I'm not exactly sure it matters, right? He is often put as kind of the counterpoint to Confucius, in that, not a counterpoint so much as an example of good Confucian ideals. Being very empathetic, being involved with the people around you, treating family well, venerating the elders, and looking out for those around you, and participating in a way that is centered around the idea of a meritocracy, right? Do good, gain success, right? However, right, he did spend a good bit of time writing and existing much more in that Taoist space of harmony with nature, particularly when he's out with Li Bai, right? So when he's living as the recluse poet, he gets a lot of that space in. When he goes back to the capital, it inherently kind of is often characterized as moving back into more Confucius ideals, which does make sense because it's much more about the community rather than is the relationships with the natural, right? But I don't necessarily think it's that simple of a question. I think all three of these schools definitely play into his work. We'll talk a little bit about it, but all of these philosophies heavily intermingled in him, all right? And I think trying to prescribe him over to one against the other inherently sometimes removes some of the empathy behind, I think, what he's trying to speak. He's looking at other people and treating them as humans. And by trying to make him an example of a philosophy, I think we remove a lot of his humanity, right? The idea that he needs to be one or the other exclusively or majority or whatever is a meaningless determination. And I think if you look at his work through any of these three kind of like big melting pot ideas, right, through a Buddhist metaphysical lens, a Taoist one, or a Confucian one, each one is like a viable and healthy and useful angle in which you can look at his work, right? But then we have other ideas like determinism, which is something like literalism, technical angles of looking at things. All of these get brought up in the scans, right? The pragmatist, right? They're all couched in philosophy that isn't necessarily predominantly or exclusively Chinese in its thought, right? But have different influences and times that they come into play within Chinese culture, right? An important thing to keep in mind, for example, is that this idea of, that level of imperial service, of like taking the exam and going, like that lasts all the way up until the early 20th century, right? Before there was an attempt at reform, right? Some form of that has existed. There's a long continuation of ideals here. So when you take a look at these scans, I don't blame you if at points your eyes somewhat glaze over. They get very technical, right? But I think it's interesting to look at each of these and just ask yourself, even if you take in the first, page or two of each chapter of it, just what benefit does it give me to think this way about Dufu's writing, rather? And what does it do for me? Does it make the work better or worse? How does it interplay? Okay. So that's just kind of a crash course on that. There's a lot of history and philosophy behind that we can go into more depth about. If you ever have questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to kind of riff from there. But the next and last chunk for this unit will be, we're going to go through the book, pick out a specific selection of poems, and kind of talk about the poetics in general. Okay?